Okay, my name is Jennifer Kelly. I'm a copyright liaison here in the library. I work with faculty to answer questions about copyright in general. This session will be covering some basics that are specific to online teaching. So let's get things rolling here as we get a couple more people dropping in and attending. So here we go. Copyright basics. So I know a couple of you have attended some of the other webinars, and some of you might know some things about copyright, and some of you might have some questions about copyright. So on this screen, what I'd like you to do, or in the chat box, to go ahead and type in what you know about copyright, or questions about what you want to know about copyright, specifically about online teaching. So to write on this screen, let me just grab my pointer here. Right above the slide, you can see there are some tools that you can use, including a pen. You can draw shapes, which wouldn't be too useful for communicating, but you can do that. And you can also type text in. So I'm going to go ahead and get started here. Give you an example, and feel free also to use the chat box, or if you have a microphone, you can speak your questions too. So that's just an example of how the text works. Let's see. Okay, so we've got a comment in chat. Not much, but what I remember from the last webinar about Creative Commons information. Great. That will come in handy. Anyone else? Any questions, things that you're hoping to learn? Not much here either. That's all right. That's why it's a basics session. We'll get you covered. And if you do have any questions as we go along, please feel free to, raise your hand or just throw something into the chat box. Okay. So proceeding, a little bit of background information for copyright for this session. Let's see. Teaching online is different than teaching face-to-face, and if you've taught online, you know that. Pedagogically, it's different, but in regard to copyright, it's also different. Most copyright laws were created a good long time ago and did not take into account technological advances when it comes to distance education. So in 2002, George Bush signed into law the Technology, Education, and Copyright Harmonization Act, also known as the TEACH Act. Throw this up here for you. TEACH Act of 2002. And so its goal was to clarify permissible uses in distance education. And so you're probably familiar with some of the guidelines that go along with face-to-face teaching. Like you can make some copies as long as they're not super long. You can hand them out to your students in class, things like that. You can show videos, et cetera, et cetera. So the TEACH Act was an attempt to make it clear what you can and can't do in regards to sharing copyright protected materials in an online class. Okay. It's complicated. There's a lot to it, as you can imagine. So I'm going to be giving sort of best practices, but not going into too much detail about the TEACH Act. There are things that you can think of that might come up in an online class that wouldn't in a face-to-face class. Issues you can think of related to copyright or concerns. Anything you can think of? It's kind of a vague and open question. I'll give everybody a chance to think about that. Like why the TEACH Act might have been necessary. Any thoughts? There we go. Legal clarification, absolutely. Because people, if you're teaching online for the first time, especially in the early 2000s, you probably just be winging it, right? So trying to do the same things that you were doing in your face-to-face class, just kind of trying to make them happen in an online class without a lot of guidance. Absolutely. So let's see, concerns about students posting without understanding the law. Absolutely. What can students post? What can they share? What can they upload? Especially, thinking about the early 2000s, lots of file sharing going on. So can you do that in an online class? What are the rules and regulations there? Teachers being blocked from using content could be an issue as well, absolutely. So there's lots of things that can come up in an online class that you wouldn't necessarily think of in a face-to-face class just because of the technology that's built into teaching online. It is easier in many ways, to share things with a lot of people. It's easier to make copies of something online. In lots of ways, it's free, as opposed to, if you wanted to share something like a movie with all of your students, it would be really time consuming to make a DVD copy of a movie and give it to each of your students in a class, right? So you wouldn't do that. You would just show the movie. But in an online class, without even really thinking about it, you could accidentally be giving students an entire movie that they could just download and suddenly they would keep, because it's an electronic file. So there are protections and safeguards built in to prevent that from happening. Great, excellent. So let's talk about this a little bit. Again, simplifying the concepts. I've built this around these 4 questions that you should be asking yourself in developing your online classes and using materials, especially materials that you have not created yourself. So straightforward, is it protected by copyright? Is access limited to my students, and just my students in this class? Is the material necessary for my teaching? And am I using this work this semester or every semester? So it's something that you're using regularly. We'll talk a little bit about each of these. So the first question, is it protected by copyright? First off, what is protected by copyright? It's good to know, right? Pretty much everything is protected by copyright. If you go to Google and Google something, an image or a video or some music or some text, that material is almost definitely going to be protected by copyright. Even if you're using Creative Commons licensed materials, those are protected by copyright. They just have licenses that allow you to use them. So things that are not protected, we've got a short list here. There are works that are not protected by copyright. What are those? Those are things like materials created by the United States government. Those are not copyrightable. Forms, ideas, some things that might be protected by trademark but not copyright, things like that. Works where the copyright has expired, so materials that are in the public domain, you can use those. So for example, the text that you might find on Project Gutenberg or the C.O.D Trust. And finally, works that have been put into the public domain by their creators. So in our last session, we talked about works on Pixabay. I'll share that in the box here. Mostly images, vector images, some clip art in there. All of those works, whoever's created them has donated them to the public domain, so you can use them. You do whatever you want with them. Those are not protected by copyright. So those things, do what you like in an online class. If you own the material, like you created it yourself, you own the copyright. You've created PowerPoint slides, you've drawn a picture using whatever tool you have at your disposal. You've taken photographs and digitized them, you want to upload those. You can use those in your online class without worrying about it. So those are some things to think about. If it is protected by copyright, that doesn't mean that you can't use it. You just have to take an extra step to consider how you're going to use them in your class. So you can get permission. asking the copyright owner, can I use this in my class? You can seek a license similar to a Creative Commons license, but again, maybe asking permission. Can I license this ebook for use in my class? Can I license this video for use in my online class? There are lots of educational exceptions you can take advantage of, and we'll talk a little bit about those. And of course, you can claim fair use, which is something we're going to talk about more because it's a very flexible and useful tool within copyright that should be used as much as possible. And I think is the most straightforward way of using copyright protected materials in an educational setting. Okay, so that's your first question to ask. Is it protected by copyright? 9 times out of 10, your answer is going to be yes. And then you have to consider, okay, if it is, then what? How am I going to work with this? Our second question is access to the copyrighted work limited to just my students? The simple rule for this is use Blackboard. Use Blackboard for sharing any materials that are protected by copyright. Don't use a publicly facing website. So if you have a WordPress page for your course, don't share copyrighted materials on it. If you have, if you're using a free version of Canvas or the free version of Blackboard, something that is not password protected, do not share copyrighted materials on it. Don't email works to your students. So don't email PDFs, don't email image files. The best thing to do is to provide links to materials to your students using Blackboard. All right, so you want them to read an article, provide the link to that article. And we'll talk just briefly about using C.O.D databases in order to find materials and share materials in online classes for your students. Use the links. Don't download the PDF and then upload the PDF. It might save some steps for your students, but we want them, A, to have the experience of finding these materials and navigating the library's databases, but also we want to avoid copyright issues, which would be involved in this upload, download of image files, PDFs, videos, things like that. Okay. So Blackboard answers a lot of questions that the Teach Act has us ask. So it limits access to just the students who are enrolled in a class for a certain period of time. It is protected, it's maintained by our IT. So using Blackboard takes a lot of the guesswork out of the Teach Act for us. The third question I want you to ask is the material necessary for your teaching? Are you using an image that looks good on a page but isn't pedagogically necessary? Then don't use it. If it's, oh, this would look really pretty. I really like the way that this image kind of speaks to what I'm doing. Maybe it's a piece of clip art. Maybe it's something funny. You've got a video or a GIF or something that is entertaining and is eye-catching that maybe you'd use in a PowerPoint in your face-to-face class, but you want to use it in your Blackboard course. If it doesn't convey instructional content, don't use it. That's the most simple thing I can say in terms of just best practices. You can make a fair use argument, or again, if you want to use images just so that you're not sharing giant blocks of texts with your student, you just want something in there to break up some text, use images that are licensed, Creative Commons licensed, or freely available in the public domain. Okay, so consider the use of the material. Does it support learning outcomes? Is it required for your students in order to complete an assignment? And if not, you don't use it. The final question to think about is a little bit, well, not too confusing. I think it's pretty straightforward, but this applies both to face-to-face classes and online classes, but tends to happen in face-to-face classes, I think, because it's easy to, build up an online course and then not change too much of it, because it doesn't involve as much prep in terms of, making copies, etc. So if you are using a work every semester, you've uploaded scanned pages from a book, you've included a video, you're using a high definition artwork image file. You should be running these things through what's called the spontaneity test. So back in 1976, this is a long name, the Ad Hoc Committee of Educational Institutions and Organizations on Copyright Law Revision, together with the Authors League of America and the Association of American Publishers, approved an agreement. And that agreement is called the Guidelines for Classroom Copying in Not-for-Profit Educational Institutions with respect to books and periodicals. So nice, easy to roll off of the tongue title there for that guideline. I'll throw that into chat for you. There you go. And I'll even provide a link if you want to read the whole thing. Fascinating stuff. Basically, what these guidelines say, and you're probably familiar with a version of this, but the guidelines say that copying for classrooms, and this was specifically, because this is 1976, this was specifically for face-to-face classrooms, but this applies as well. Copying for classrooms has to meet brevity and spontaneity, so it can't be super long, and it has to be spontaneous. And the definition for this on the slide is the copying is at the instance and inspiration of the individual teacher. So this is your idea, and you've just thought of it, and the inspiration decision to use the work and the moment of its use for maximum teaching effectiveness are so close in time that it would be unreasonable to expect a timely reply to a request for permission. So an example of this would be you're reading the newspaper. There is an article in the newspaper that speaks to your lecture content for the day. You make photocopies of the article, you distribute them to your students, and it informs your discussion in class that day. That's spontaneous. It would not be as effective, the use of this material would not be as effective if you were to contact the newspaper, ask for copying permission, go through all that trouble. By the time all that happened, it wouldn't be as useful to you, right? So that's spontaneity. So to use these materials in your class, brevity, spontaneity, and a couple other things. It has to meet the cumulative effect test, and each copy has to include a notice of copyright. Those are the guidelines. The key to the spontaneity test is this idea that the inspiration decision to use the work and the moment of its use are so close that it's unreasonable to expect a request for permission. If you're using this work every semester, that expectation changes, right? You've used it this one time because you found it and you want to use it this week. Next semester, what's keeping you from asking for permission to use it? Spontaneity no longer applies. So this is something to consider. If you are using copyrighted material semester to semester to semester without asking for permission, you are likely violating copyright. And again, you've got all these things in Blackboard. You have, only your students have access to it. It's not like, the copyright owner is going to find out and sue you, but these are best practices. So something to consider. And also consider that these guidelines guidelines for classroom copying, which again, you're probably most familiar with some sort of arbitrary number, like it's okay to copy something from a book as long as it's one chapter out of a multi-chapter book, or it's okay to copy something if it's 10 pages or shorter, or one poem out of an anthology. These, as the title of this piece of copyright information indicates, these are guidelines. These are not copyright law, but they're thought of as best practices. Right? So there's nothing that actually in the law says you can only copy 10 pages of something, but they're guidelines that we've all agreed to use since the late 70s. Any questions about these questions? Okay, a quick recap here. The Teach Act in a nutshell, these are your best practices. Use Blackboard for sharing course content. Provide links to content instead of uploading materials. Don't use illegally copied materials. I hope that goes without saying. If you bought something really cheap on the street, and don't upload that and share it with your students. Upload materials that are specifically designed for classroom use. Copyright educational exceptions rely on something called transformative use. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But you as an educator have the option to use materials that are not specifically designed for classroom use, such as a poem or a piece of artwork or an article from a journal or a newspaper. They might be educational, like this is an educational journal, but they're not designed for classroom use. So this is speaking directly to things like textbooks, course packs, all of these things. So these have usually specific licensing issues, and by using them in a classroom, you're not finding a new use for them, right? Another thing, don't upload things that students would otherwise be paying for individually. We can understand the impulse to save students money, and like, oh, well, they could buy this short, little tiny book of like 20 pages for $5, but I could just scan it and upload it and save them $20. That is a violation of copyright. So best practices again, if a student should be buying it, they should be buying it. If you can find it online for free and provide a link to it, you can do that, but don't upload the content yourself. Any questions about these best practices here? Are there issues that maybe are not addressed by these? An exception you can think of, or a concern that you have? Okay, moving on. So more important than the Teach Act, because of its flexibility. Oh, here's a question. Most of the time, does getting permission cover using copyright material? Yes, so getting permission from a copyright owner would be a matter of, stating what you wanted to use the material for, how long you would want to use it. And it could be just a matter of the author saying, absolutely, you can make this chapter available to your students this semester for free. And that would be the permission that they are giving you. It could be, absolutely, you can use this chapter of this book for your students this semester if you pay me X amount, which would be a licensing deal. And these are things that the library can help you with if you ever have any questions. But yeah, so permission would be used when you would like to use copyright protected material in a way that would not be covered by fair use. And we do have a guide on the topic and some let's see, a template, I suppose, for asking for permission on the library's copyright page. So I'm just going to post the link to that in the chat box here for you. And you should be able to find that under copyright for faculty, I think. Okay, so back to fair use. We did have a session on fair use earlier this semester, but a quick overview of it because it's especially useful when you're talking about teaching in an online environment. So there's fair use is determined through something called a four-factor test. And if you're making a fair use analysis, say I want to use this video clip in my online class. Okay, I have it, it's a digital object, I want to upload it to my class, and I'm going to make this decision based on weighing these four factors. So the four factors include the purpose and character of your use. So why are you using it? When you're teaching here at C.O.D, the answer is always going to be the purpose of my use is educational, nonprofit educational. This favors fair use, which makes it very easy. So that's a corner of this box you can always check off. The nature of the copyrighted work. What are you using? Are you, is it, and we'll get a little bit into the details here of what favors and what doesn't favor, but what kind of thing is it? Is it creative? Is it nonfiction? Is it educational? Is it entertainment? Bottom left-hand corner, the amount and substantiality of the work used. How much are you using? Are you using the whole thing, just a little bit? If it's an image, is it really high resolution or is it just a thumbnail? Bottom right-hand corner, the effect of the use upon the potential market. This talks a little bit about that, the things we talked about in spontaneity. Is there a way that you can easily license this? Or would it be really challenging to do that? So how you answer these questions is going to determine whether or not you can make a successful fair use analysis of a copyright material, of using a material. So let's look at each of these factors individually. Factor one, purpose. As you can see, nonprofit, educational, personal, or transformative uses favor fair use. A transformative use would include parody, satire, news reporting, research, any of the scholarly applications of it, favor fair use. Commercial uses do not favor fair use. So I'm going to argue anytime you're teaching here at C.O.D, because we're a non-for-profit educational institution, your purpose will favor fair use. Next, the nature of the use. The nature of the work. Works that are factual and published favor fair use. Highly creative works or unpublished works weigh against fair use. So, for example, a documentary versus a feature film. The documentary, you're going to make a stronger argument for fair use than showing a popular film in your online class. Same thing goes for written works. So a biography versus a novel. Poetry would fall into the highly creative category. Critical works would fall into the factual category. The third factor is the amount of the work. Obviously, the more of the work that you're using, the less it favors fair use. The entirety of the work absolutely does not favor fair use. Something called the heart of the work. So, for example, the most important or substantial piece of it. It's a novel and you want to copy the denouement. That's not going to work. More than needed, you're trying to provide context maybe, that argues against fair use. So smaller amount, what's appropriate for the transformative purpose. So again, if it's a satire or parody, how much of it do you have to use in order to get that across? If it's for the point of scholarship and research, can you just share a part of it? If it's images, using a thumbnail image instead of a high resolution image, that favors fair use. When you search Google images, those images tend to be small and not of really high quality because Google also has to follow rules of copyright. So they're using thumbnail images because they do not own the copyright to these materials. But by providing just little images, they can make a fair use argument for how they're using those images that they don't own. Finally, the effect of the use on the market. So the proposed use is transformative. We talked about what that means. Or the amount is so small that it would not have an effect on the market. You're just using a paragraph. You're just using a small image. If the original is out of print, you can make a fair use argument because it does not have an effect on the market. The book's not available. So obviously you can't be taking away from the marketplace. If the copyright owner is unidentifiable, there's these things called orphan works where nobody knows who owns the copyright to something. So you can make a fair use argument saying like, I can't ask for permission, there's nobody to ask. On the other side, weighing against fair use, your use is not transformative. You're just sharing it. So for example, a movie just for the sake of watching a movie. Using this competes with an original. So if it's available otherwise, that's problematic. Or if you're just sharing this and there's an easy way for you to share it by paying for it, by asking permission or getting a license, but you're just not doing that, that does not favor fair use. It's really important to remember that fair use is balancing, and it's balancing all four effects at the same time. So you could, just because, for example, in teaching, we almost always have an educational purpose and a transformative use of materials that we might be using all of a book, right? So it's a complex system of determining, balance those, and the analysis can be a little bit complicated. So there are tools. Oops, a little ahead of myself. Oh, here we go. Educational exemption tool, fair use tool that's available from the library's as well. And in the fair use workshop, which you can watch, we talk a little bit about how to keep track of these things. There's a checklist you can use. And if you're ever making a fair use analysis of a work that you online class or face-to-face class, I highly recommend keeping track that you've made. So why have you decided that this is fair use in terms of amount or fair use of the work, and just keeping that on record. About fair use to ask, did the use transform the material? We're talking about the use of a for something other than its intended purposes. Generally, like I said, using materials for education that were not specific for education, that's considered transformative. And finally, was appropriate in kind and amount considering the nature of the copyright work and the use. So really honestly have to use the entire thing. or can you get away with just a little bit? Is it that you provide the largest possible resolution of the, or is it acceptable for you to use a smaller amount? That sort of is the nub and the gist of fair use. Any questions about that? A quiet crowd today. That's okay. Oh, here we go. Makes sense. I'm glad. That's good. That's encouraging. All right. So, a little side note here, because it comes up a lot when I'm faculty about, especially images, using images in presentations, things like that. The difference between citing, acknowledging, and okay. What I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on the topic. So if you have any comments or questions or things that you can think of or things that you think might come up often, go ahead and type those in. The difference between citing something, acknowledging something, and copyright. Not sure the differences. That's fine. It's the places this comes up most often is public sharing site like YouTube. Oh, you're equals giving credit, acknowledging, same but less formal, and copyright is legal. Absolutely. So yeah, those are some definitions of how all these things differ. And also, so something that you've probably seen before, maybe you haven't taken note, but on a site like YouTube, someone's uploaded a movie or movie clips or something, or music, and they'll say, "I don't own the copyright to this." They say where it came from, right? So citing your source is a cure for plagiarism, but it's copyright infringement. So you can cite using MLA, APA, Chicago style, perfect citation, and still violate copyright. Right? The two things are not connected. Acknowledging comes into play, I would say, when we're using copyright materials in educational. So, for example, if we go back, let me find an appropriate. So, my key questions here at the bottom, I'm acknowledging came from, right? Association of Research Libraries. I have a link. Code of best use, 2012. It's not specifically a citation. It's a little bit of a citation. If I had images, and I don't think I do have any images in my. Oh yes, I do. Here we go. Let me go back to. Really see it because the link here is blue. Just too bad. Right here, I'm acknowledging. Here we go. Where this image came from, right? Licensed, Creative Commons. Let's see. I can see it on my other page here. Okay. Attribution share alike 4.0 license, which means I can and adapt it as long as I provide an attribution. This is I'm just acknowledging where the information comes from based on the license is best practices, and I encourage you students do this as well. Just say where the information is coming from when they're images or videos. This is outside of creating a or anything like that. Again, because we're doing work, less concerned about the copyright here. Closed environment, just you and me out here in this class, whether it's if we're doing face to face, doing it online through something like that. So only a few people have access to it. If I were doing on a bigger scale and maybe showing a video or using other images, I might be violating copyright if I'm citing my sources. Does that make sense? It's a little. I think what I'm trying to get across here is modeling practices for students and making between citing sources and adhering to and how those two things are connected. But so the way that they're all connected is this idea of someone having taken the time to add to our cultural commons. So works of scholarship, works of art, science, technology, which bring in more patent and trademark and intellectual property laws. But all of these things are available. Access to these things, whether it's freely available or we only have access through library databases. They're made available so that we can work with them and contribute ourselves to the conversation or to the artistic commons. Our uses in order to give credit to the work that has helped us create our work. As Google Scholar says, standing on the shoulder of giants, the giants being those who've created or building upon. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me see if I can. Does anyone else have issues? I don't know if I just moved too far away from my microphone or something here. Hopefully the recording will come out okay. I don't over my sky right now. I don't know if that's coming through on the microphone. They're very loud. These connections between the reason why we cite things and the reason why things are protected by copyright. We're talking about the artists and the writers and the creators. They have and certain rights that they have, and we acknowledge those rights, or we cite, or we acknowledge, or we license. So that's just an aside there. So this is a resource on exceptions for instruction law. So these are the things that you can do as an educator in your classes with. It's a really great little. The URL is down here, but it's also linked off of that copyright page under area for tools there. So I recommend taking a look at this. It answers questions about what, it asks you questions about what are you going to do? What is it that you're using? How are you going to and tells you whether or not, oh yeah, go for it, or you need to ask for permission. Resources for you. So is full of resources for your online classes. They are all licensed use, so you can very easily share them with your students. Again, thanks. looking for permalinks, persistent URLs. This will allow you to ensure that your students can access these easily. If you have questions about how to ensure that a link will be accessible to your students, you can contact the library. We'll happily help you identify where to find those persistent links databases. I think we also have a couple of tutorials online that can help you with that too. By using articles from libraries databases, by using ebooks, doing music and images from the library's databases, you can feel confident those materials are not violating copyright, that you are within educational exceptions and other, that's safe for library content. And if you ever have questions about, I found, can I use it? That's a great question for me, and I'm happy to answer those questions at any point. So wrap up. This is our fourth and final copyright webinar of the semester. All of the webinar recordings are available online from the copyright website, which again is linked in the comments here, codlrc.org. All of the tools that I've shared that help you make or determine whether or not you need to get permission, all that good stuff is available. And just to share my information again, I am happy to answer questions about copyright. Send me an email. What it is that you want to do, that you're trying to do, the material that you're trying to work with. I will find some answers for you. Does anyone else as we wrap up? No, you're welcome. Absolutely. Well, thank you all. Have a wonderful afternoon, and out for our next series of webinars, which will be coming in the summer of academic integrity.